Beneath the shade of a young apple tree by the railroad tracks, a German shepherd lay quietly, his eyes calm, yet ever watchful, as if guarding something far more precious than his own life. The story began with an old map, a heart-pounding rescue in the depths of a mine, and ended in a reunion that left the entire town breathless. But behind Ranger's steadfast gaze lies a secret he has never revealed. Will you listen to the whole story to uncover what it is? The rails of Ash Hollow cut through the valley like two dull knives left out in the frost. Pitted and brown with the memory of seasons, and on this late October morning, a breathless cold crept up from the ties and into the bones of anyone foolish or desperate enough to walk there. Which is to say, Lila Moore and her twin sister Clara, and the German shepherd who shadowed their steps like a third heartbeat. Ranger moved a few paces ahead, his sable coat dusted in powdery grit from the old ballast, his left hind leg favoring the other, but his nose working the air with a steady purpose that had long ago taught the girls to trust him when words were scarce and time was thin. They had left their two-room cabin before first bell the pale sun, barely alive behind a veil of low clouds, the breath from their mouths drifting and vanishing in little ghosts, the burlap sack for cans and wire and crushed copper slung over Clara's shoulder. Because she liked the weight of it, said it felt like possibility, and Lila carried the small pry bar they used to tease loose bent nails from rotting fence posts and the broken coil of wire that sometimes showed up along the right-of-way, where the maintenance crews couldn't be bothered to cart everything out. Evelyn, their mother, had coughed herself awake when they closed the door, smiled without strength, and said she would embroider a little longer before trying to nap, because embroidery in her hands still felt like a prayer sewn into something someone else might love. Ash Hollow did not wake all at once, not anymore. A century of coal and a decade of closures had taught it to rise slow and move quieter than it wished. The silos listing like old teeth and the grainy whistle from a freight 2 valleys over. Answering the wind, and the girls walked in that hush with the familiar rhythm of those who have learned routes by need rather than map stepping from tie to tie. Counting without counting, watching the ditch line for the glint of aluminum and the shadow of a copper pipe hiding under leaves and the dented rib of a gutter flashing in the pale light. Clara hummed as she walked, half a tune and half a strategy for keeping numb fingers nimble, her braid already loosening where the elastic had seen too many mornings, and she flicked the frayed cuff of her coat and said they should check the bend farther up because the wind always piled things there. And Lila, quieter as ever, tilted her head and listened to Ranger's paws scuff the gravel and the faint creak of the rails settling in the cold, and the small sounds that meant a day might turn, then nodded and said, "Yes, the bend will check the bend." They found little at first, a tangle of baling wire and one bottle cap Clara insisted on keeping because it was blue enamel with a tiny star, and Lila teased out 3 bent nails from a split plank and slid them into the sack because every ounce counted at the buyer's scale, and because she liked the clean click they made against each other, a small proof of effort that she could hold. And Ranger veered left and then right, and then came back to center with his ears like arrows and his tail a steady metronome over the ties. The wind shifted without warning, the way wind does in hollows hemmed by steep hillsides, bringing with it a thread of metallic scent and the faintest thrum underfoot that didn't belong to morning birds or distant trucks. A thread so thin, Lila might have doubted it if Ranger hadn't halted so sharply that gravel whispered under his pads. His head dipped, one paw lifted, and a sound like a breath caught in a throat came from him. Not a bark, not yet a low note from the chest. That meant attention, meant something is wrong and I can smell it, even if you cannot. Ranger. Clara said, the hum gone, the star blue cap forgotten in her fist. Lila's hand tightened around the pry bar, as if metal could understand resolve, and she saw the dog's ears lock forward in a way that always made him look younger, stronger. The limp erased by purpose, and then he moved. Not running wild, but trotting with the gravity of a shepherd, who has chosen a direction along the track toward the curve where scrub pines leaned and a shallow embankment hid what lay beyond. The thin hum underfoot turned into a whisper, and then into a suggestion of wait, not close, but coming. And Clara glanced at Lila, and didn't need to ask, because the answer was already in her eyes, so they followed. There are moments life opens like a lens, and you see more than you can hold and less than you can bear. And the curve gave them a man in a tan uniform laid across the steel like a broken gate. Wrists bound with dull nylon cord. Ankles lashed to the rail, a dark cloth across his eyes and mouth. Head bowed as if listening to the earth. Ranger went from trot to circle in 3 heartbeats, barking once sharp and triangular in the cold air. Then again louder, the second bark. Not panic, but announcement, and Lila dropped to her knees without thinking, fingers already searching the knots at the man's ankles, while Clara skidded on the gravel and grabbed for the gag, her breath coming in sudden bursts that made the cloth of her scarf pulse at her throat. The uniform smelled of dirt and old sweat and copper. And when Clara pulled the cloth down, the man sucked air in a ragged ribbon, a sound that rasped like someone who had swallowed dust, and his eyes fluttered against the blindfold. Lila's fingers burned as she worked at the tight cords, the nylon cutting her skin, and she said, "Hold his legs when I get this." And Clara said, I'm trying. But what she meant was, this knot was made by someone who wanted to keep him here, and she would not let that be. The hum became a shudder in the rails, the dull drum of mass moving through distance, and the bend turned the world into a funnel, where time narrowed. Ranger put his mouth to the man's shoulder, the way trained Yi's anchor cloth teeth set without harm. And he leaned back, pulling, as Lila pried her pry bar under the cord and twisted, until one strand snapped with a mean little pop that felt too small for what it meant. The man groaned, the sound of someone meeting his body again after being away from it too long. And one boot scraped free of the rail and then snagged on the tie and then came loose. And then nothing mattered except momentum and friction and the weight of a life in their hands. The horn cried from beyond the bend. Not yet a scream, but already too human to ignore, and it raised the hairs on Lila's neck, because she knew the echo in this hollow would lie to them about distance, even as the rails told the truth beneath her knees. Clara knelt so fast she tore her palm on a spike head, and didn't feel it got both hands under the man's calves, and yelled wordlessly, a sound of effort and refusal braided together. And Lila took the man's forearms and dug her heels into the crushed stone and pulled. And Ranger leaned and pulled, and the world narrowed to the length of a body and the width of 2 rails. The first rush of air came before the engine, a cold shove that flattened Clara's braid against her back and scattered grit into Lila's eyes, and the horn lifted into a howl. Now not for drama, but because everything heavy that cannot stop announces itself the way storms do. And for one timeless heartbeat, they lost purchase. And the man slipped the heel of his boot, catching in the gap. Alongside the railhead, and time, which had been a whip, became a needle threading 3 breaths into one. Lift, Lila said, not a shout, but a command that found steel in her small voice, and Clara lifted, and Ranger heaved, and the boot cleared, and they slid one shoulder, then the other, across the second rail. And then there was nothing between them and the living metal of the locomotive, but a breath, and then another, and they tumbled backward into the ditch as the engine tore through the frame of their moment, with a sound like the sky being ripped, the wind punching their coats flat, the gravel leaping into the air and raining down the horn in their bones, the vibration going through their teeth and into the ground, and then away. Silence returned in pieces. The click of cooling steel, the wary patter of ballast stones, settling the far tail of the horn, losing its shape in the hills. Clara's laugh that wasn't a laugh so much as a sob that ran out of instructions. Ranger's panting fast and regular, his eyes bright and fixed on their faces as if counting them. Lila blinked grit and tears from her lashes and looked at the man who lay on his side now. Chest moving in shallow waves, lips cracked and bleeding at the corners, a shadow across his jaw where a bruise would spread like spilled ink by evening. Sir Lila said, because he was older and uniformed, and because naming someone back into the world seemed necessary. You're safe, you're out. And she didn't know if that was true beyond these rails. But it was true on them. And that was the geography she could control. He coughed and winced as if the cough were a thief, and his eyelids fluttered against the blindfold, and Clara slipped it free with gentle fingers now that time had expanded to the size of mercy again. The eyes beneath were gray, the kind that held weather, and for a breath they were unfocused. And then they found the winter sky, and then they found the girls, and then they found Ranger, who had stepped close enough that his breath touched the man's cheek like a warm hand. Logan, he said. Or perhaps it was an echo of his name. And then clearer, because identity is a stubborn flame. Logan Ward, and he tried to sit and found all the places in his ribs that disagreed, and he let his head rest back against the earth and shut his eyes and opened them again, as if refusing to let the world blur. Clara looked down at her torn palm, and only then felt the sting a web of bright red lines where nylon and metal had kissed skin, and she cradled it to her coat without complaint and said, "We have to move him farther. The next freight will blow the wind back and he'll catch gravel in his face." And Lila nodded, because practical kindness was their dialect, so they worked together, Ranger nosing at Logan's sleeve, as if to count his breaths and keep them honest, and they eased him farther down the slope, until frozen weeds cushioned his shoulder, and the remaining hum under the rails was nothing more than a rumor. Up close, Logan carried the story of the last 12 hours on his skin, the raw grooves the cords had left at his wrists, the dust embedded in his collar, the faint chemical smell that clung to the cloth that had gagged him, a smell that made Lila think of engine cleaner and warehouse floors and the back rooms of places that didn't invite sunlight. He frowned as if searching a page in his mind that had been torn, and then he breathed steadier and his focus sharpened, and he said, "You shouldn't be on the rails." But his tone held gratitude more than scold. "We come for metal," Clara said, not as apology but as inventory, and she lifted the torn burlap sack as proof, and the absurdity of the bottle cap and the bent nails against the gravity of what they had just done made Lila want to laugh when she smiled instead, the quick flash of teeth that meant we're still here. "Can you stand?" Lila asked, and Logan tested the question with a small shift, the sort of movement that tells a body the borders of its pain, and he grimaced, but nodded. And they gave him their hands, small palms against a bigger, colder grip, and he rose in increments until gravity accepted a new bargain. And then he swayed, and they steadied him, and Ranger pressed his shoulder into Logan's thigh as if he were a cane with a heartbeat. The sky opened just enough for the sun to glance off the rails and lay a weak strip of gold across the ties, and the light made Logan's badge flash under a smear of dirt, the star catching, and Clara saw the name stitched above the pocket and sounded it out softly. Ward, as if learning a new vowel, and Logan breathed once more longer than the last and said deputy. "But that seems like another man's clothes right now." And then he smiled, small and crooked, and the girls felt the day tilt toward survivable. They needed shade and a place out of the wind for 10 minutes. Just long enough for the trembling in everyone's hands to become something like steadiness again. There was an old utility shed beyond the ditch, its siding peeling roof sagging like a tired back. And Lila led them there, picking a path that avoided the slick patches of mud half hidden by frost, while Clara kept pace on the other side. Her free hand hovered in case Logan slipped, and Ranger scouted both ahead and back, head turning in efficient arcs that made him look like a metronome keeping time for courage. Inside the shed, the air was still, and smelled of mildewed paint and ancient rain, the light falling in through gaps, where boards no longer met, and they settled Logan onto a crooked workbench as if placing a fragile instrument between songs. He flexed his fingers and watched the blood return to them. And something about his gaze, the way it catalogued detail without panic, told Lila he was not a man easily undone even when the world had tried to unmake him. "Thank you." He said the word simple because anything more elaborate would have broken in the air, and he reached for the pocket at his chest and stopped halfway, because his ribs protested, then let his hand fall. And Lila, without quite understanding why, pulled the little notebook from her own coat, the one she filled with lists of things to find and routes to walk, and the names of people who would trade fairly, and tore out a corner page and pressed a pencil into Clara's palm, because Clara liked the sound of lead on paper, and said, "Write it down." What Clara asked already writing, because her hand trusted Lila's voice. "That he's alive today," Lila said, and then quieter, and that Ranger saved him first, and the dog, hearing his name in a sentence that held warmth, thumped his tail once against the rotten plank and rested his chin on Logan's knee, as if punctuating the note. The wind shouldered the shed and moved on, and far away another train stitched its sound through the hills, a reminder that time was a long rail line, and they had only just stepped onto a siding. Logan tried again for his pocket, and this time finished the motion. Pulling free an old card, the county emblem worn nearly smooth at the corners, and he set it on the bench between them and said, "Logan Ward, Deputy Ash Hollow." And then, because names are more than introduction when shared in rooms like this, "I'll come by later to thank your mother." Clara glanced at Lila and back at Logan and weighed the distance between gratitude and caution the way kids from broken towns do as naturally as breathing. She nodded once and said, "We'll tell her," and then she pulled the corner of the note free from the notebook and wrote in small, careful letters, "We didn't know what else to do. Sorry about your shoulder. Lila and Clara. P.S. Ranger says hi," and folded it twice, then tucked it into the breast pocket of his uniform, because it seemed proper that something warm should sit above the ribs until he got home. Lila stepped to the shed door and looked out at the rails, the curve now empty and ordinary. Again, the way danger always pretends, it was never there once it passes, and she felt the shape of the morning rearrange inside her. The way certain hours become hinges on which the rest of a life swings. Behind her, Ranger lifted his head and sniffed the doorway and pressed against her leg for a moment, his weight a quiet vow. And she let her hand rest on his neck and felt the dense heat of him and the pulse that beat there, steady and sure. They walked Logan back to the service road, where a slow county truck would eventually wander by, or where a passing farmer might be flagged with a wave. And in that 50 yards, the sky brightened by a degree, and the day softened at the edges, and the sharp ache in Clara's palm turned into a throb that would scab and go pink and then silver. And the cold in Lila's fingertips gave way to prickles as blood argued its way back, and Logan's steps grew more certain, because nothing helps a body like the geography of escape behind it. At the road, he leaned a hip against a battered post and turned to them with the sober attention of a man who has measured his debts and knows their weight. "I won't forget this," he said. And the rhythm of his voice made it a promise more than a phrase, and Lila nodded because she had no use for people who said things they couldn't carry. Ranger stood square and lifted his chin the slightest tilt that looked like pride and felt like recognition. And Logan reached to scratch behind one ear. His fingers gentled by knowledge of pain, and the dog closed his eyes for the length of that touch, the way animals do when they decide a person belongs in the circle of watchfulness rather than the field of worry. Clara, wanting to fold the moment into something that could travel, said, "There's a clinic down on Mill where they don't ask too many questions if you limp in." And Logan smiled with half his mouth and said he knew it had walked more than one scared kid through that door. And the girls stored that detail like a coin for later, because it meant his work ran through their lives even before this morning. They parted then Logan to the road, and the uncertain parade of helped the girls back along the rails, and the long belly of the day. Ranger trotting between as if he could glue both halves of the world together, with his shadow walking past the curve, where the horn's screams still seemed to hang in the weeds, past the place where their footprints told the story of 3 bodies struggling against momentum and winning past a tangle of ragweed that had caught a thread from Logan's sleeve and held it like a flag. By the time the cabin came into view, smoke a thin gray ladder from the stovepipe, the cold had lost its bite and turned mean, instead working its way into the wet cuffs of their jeans, and Lila felt the ache of coming warmth. The way it makes fingers sting and hearts go tender, and she wondered how to tell Evelyn what had happened without making her breath go shallow with worry. Clara pushed the door and called out before stepping in, because she liked the music of a voice entering a room. and their mother looked up from her hoop, the thread the color of field flowers, and saw their faces. And something in her loosened, something that had been the fear you swallow and pretend is water. "Busy morning?" Evelyn asked, and Clara nodded as if she were answering about chores, because sometimes the truth needed to be stabilized before it could be spoken. And she set the burlap on the table, and Lila set the pry bar by the door, and Ranger went straight to the worn rug near the stove and turned twice and lay down with a sigh so big it shook a laugh out of Evelyn, even before she knew why. They washed their hands, Lila's blood a faint algebra in the sink, Clara's stripe of red like a message she would carry into sleep, and then they told it. Not rushing, not lingering for drama, just letting the minutes stand, one beside the next, the rails, the curve, the bound man, the horn that tried to tear the world, the pulling and the breath and the afterwards. Evelyn listened with her hands still, and in the middle she reached out and pressed 2 fingers to Ranger's shoulder, as if reading the truth from his fur. And when they finished, she exhaled a long thread of air and nodded and said a sentence that wrapped courage and fear in the same cloth. Sometimes mercy runs on rails too. Later, when the small square of afternoon sunlight crept across the floorboards like a shy visitor, and the house settled into that deep quiet that feels like a refuge. Earned. Lila opened her notebook and wrote the date and one uncomplicated line. We took a man off the tracks, and the day did not break, and underneath it she sketched a quick little triangle of dog ears and the suggestion of a wagging tail. Clara tried to stitch with Evelyn, but the bandage made the needle clumsy, so she lay on her belly near Ranger and told him the story again in whispers, because she liked the way he blinked in time with her, as if punctuating the parts where courage had leaned forward. Evening came earlier than anyone wanted the hills, pocketing the light, and a distant engine sang itself down the line with a kinder horn that blurred like a lullaby in the cold. Lila stood at the window and watched a single crow ride the wind above the treetops, and thought about the way Logan's eyes had found their faces and stayed resolute, and a small spark that had been dormant for so long. She'd forgotten its shape shifted in her chest, an ember labeled, maybe an ember labeled more, when the knock finally came soft and measured against the doorframe, as if the knuckles were respecting the fragility of rooms where hope had learned to whisper. Ranger lifted his head, but stayed on the rug, ears hightail slow, and Lila exchanged a look with Clara that carried a whole conversation across the space between them. Clara rose, biting at her lip only once, and Evelyn set her hoop down and folded the blanket over her knees, and Lila reached for the latch heart, knocking louder than the hand outside, and told herself she already knew who would be standing there in the last light, Logan Ward bound earlier, and breathing now, a face cut with ache and purpose, a piece of paper folded in his palm, and behind him, the shadow of a road that led to questions, larger than any of them, had yet named the kind that travel at the speed of steel and secrets, and will not be outrun. The first thing Logan Ward knew was light thin, filtered through yellowed curtains, carrying with it the scent of antiseptic and old wood. It lay across him in slanted stripes, cutting the small room into slices of gold and shadow. For a moment he didn't move. He listened instead to the slow click of a ceiling fan, the muffled murmur of voices somewhere beyond the half-open door, the muted scrape of a chair on worn linoleum. And underneath it all, the dull, persistent ache in his ribs, a reminder of the rails, the cold the cords, and the sound of a horn coming far too fast. He tried a shallow breath, then another. The pain crept along his side like ivy. He managed a small, rueful laugh that scratched his throat. Still alive, he thought. His lips moved with the words, but they came out as more of a whisper than a statement. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, deliberate in her movements, wearing green scrubs and a dark bun tucked under a cap. She carried herself like someone used to making quick decisions in chaos. "You're awake," she said, her voice even, with a kind of grounded authority that didn't invite argument. "Seems like it," Logan replied, forcing his voice to work. "Where am I, Mill Street Clinic?" she said, stepping in to check the IV at his arm. "Name's Tessa Monroe. I'm the one who made sure you didn't stop breathing in your sleep." Her eyes flicked to the bruises along his jaw. "You're lucky." Few more minutes, and it would have been a recovery, not a rescue. The words settled heavy between them. Logan's gaze drifted to the foot of the bed where his boots sat side by side, their laces untied and dark with dried mud. "What about—" He hesitated. "The girls and the dog fine," Tessa said, adjusting the IV flow without looking up. "Came in earlier to check on you, but you were out cold. We don't let visitors stay long. They've got to get back to surviving same as you." He opened his mouth to press, but she reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "The older one left this," she said. Logan took it carefully, feeling the roughness of the paper against his fingers. The handwriting was tight and awkward, the way children write when they don't have much space. "We didn't know what else to do. Sorry about your shoulder. Lila and Clara. P.S. Ranger says hi." A slow, tired smile found its way to his face. "Ranger," he murmured. Tessa studied him for a beat. "You planning to lie here and be looked after? Or are you the type who insists on moving before you should?" "I'm the type who owes a debt," he said simply. 2 hours later, with his ribs bound and his arm in a sling, Logan signed himself out. Tessa didn't argue much, only handed him a small paper bag of bandages and painkillers and a look that said she'd be here when he inevitably needed patching again. He borrowed the clinic's old county-issued truck. Its paint faded to the color of dry sage and its engine coughing like an old smoker on cold mornings. The directions Tessa gave him were scribbled on the back of a pharmacy receipt. Up the ridge road past the rusted mailboxes, left where the pavement gives up and the dirt takes over. Ash Hollow fell away behind him as he climbed. The hills were wearing their autumn coats, now burnt orange, rusty red, and the last stubborn pockets of green. Leaves whispered in the ditches as the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere unseen. The Moore house sat at the edge of the tree line, hunched under a corrugated tin roof streaked with rust. Moss grew between the porch boards, and the screen door leaned crooked in its frame. The garden out front had long since gone wild, its tangled stalks rattling softly. He parked beside the fence, killed the engine, and climbed out slowly, careful not to pull at his ribs. One knock on the door echoed inside. A child's voice called, "Wait!" And a few seconds later, the door opened just enough for a thin face to peer through. "It's you," the girl said. "Deputy Logan Ward," he replied, nodding. "I owe you a lot more than a thank you." The door opened wider. "You'd better come in before Mama sees you standing there and thinks you're the bill collector." The interior smelled faintly of wood smoke and boiled potatoes. Mismatched chairs clustered around a table with a peeling floral cover. A brick fireplace sat cold, its grate thick with ash. On the far wall, a woman sat in a recliner, with a blanket over her knees, a thimble on one finger, and a half-finished piece of embroidery in her lap. She looked up slowly. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that comes from too much time indoors, and the skin beneath her eyes was drawn. But her gaze was steady. "You're the man my girls pulled off the tracks," she said. "I am," Logan said, removing his cap, "and I'm alive because of them." From behind a hallway curtain, another girl peeked out. Her grin broke crooked across her face when she saw him. "You don't look dead anymore," she said. "I don't feel dead anymore," Logan answered, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. Ranger padded in, then tail wagging once before he sat at Logan's side like a sentinel. Logan crouched stiffly, scratched behind his ears. "You again, Hero?" Evelyn set her needlework aside. "We didn't expect a visit. I didn't come empty-handed." Logan stepped back to the porch and returned with a paper sack. From the clinic, food supplies, bean soup, fruit, first aid things, and a voucher for your checkup downtown. Evelyn stiffened. "We didn't ask for charity." "No," Logan said softly. "You earned help. I'm not giving you charity. I'm repaying a debt." Silence hung for a beat, then her shoulders eased. All right. But you'll have dinner before you go. I've got potatoes and eggs. The meal was humble boiled eggs, onions fried with potatoes, weak tea, but it was warm, and the chairs close enough that conversation carried without effort. Logan listened more than he spoke, letting the girls' voices fill the spaces. Clara told him about falling from the water tower once chasing a bottle cap. Lila spoke about how she mapped out every trash route and resale bin in town. They both laughed when they described Ranger's birth under their mother's bed, one bitter winter, back when there was still heating oil. Evelyn's cough interrupted here and there, a dry catching sound that made Logan glance at the voucher on the counter. Her hands, though thin, still moved with a certain practiced grace when she reached for the teapot or broke a potato in half. When the plates were nearly empty, Logan leaned forward, his tone quieter. What they did, it wasn't just brave. It was right. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. And what does that mean for you? It means Logan said that someone wanted me gone. Not robbed. Silenced. He looked at the tablecloth, then back up. I think it's connected to those missing girls from the state reports. The name hung unspoken, but Evelyn's gaze drifted toward the hallway where Lila and Clara were clearing the dishes. Her lips pressed together. Do what you have to do, she said finally. But don't bring the fight to my doorstep. I won't, Logan promised. Later, as the girls bustled in the kitchen, he glanced around the room again. The neat stacks of fabric by the chair, the careful way the table was set, the framed photograph on the mantel of 3 little girls, one older, smiling with an ease none of them wore now. Something in him clicked into place. The case that had been half formed in his head since the rails now had a pulse. By the time he rose to leave, night had settled over the ridge and the air outside bit at his skin. Ranger followed him to the truck, stood watching as Logan started the engine. I'll be back, he told the dog, and it wasn't a promise to the dog alone. The cold that morning had teeth. It bit through the seams of Lila Moore's coat, made the tips of her fingers ache, even inside the wool gloves Clara had found for her last winter. The frost clung stubbornly to the grass in the ditch as the twins made their way along a stretch of track they rarely walked. It was farther than they liked to go too far from home if the weather turned too far, if Evelyn's cough got bad and they needed to run back. But Evelyn had woken weaker than usual, her breath rattling. And Lila had seen the look in her mother's eyes as she tried to hide it. That look was enough to push them past the familiar scavenging grounds. More scrap meant more money. More money meant more tea and fabric, and maybe even enough for the heating oil man to come by before the frost hardened into ice. Ranger ranged ahead, as in always, his head down, nose busy paws, crunching over frost-stiff gravel. His limp was barely noticeable in the cold. Adrenaline had a way of smoothing it out, and his tail moved in slow sweeps. Clara trailed a few steps behind her sister, kicking at the occasional loose stone eyes, scanning for glints of copper or aluminum beneath the brittle weeds. They were nearing the fork, where the old spur line split from the main track, a place the freight trains hadn't touched in years. The rails there were warped rust flaking in sheets, and weeds grew between the ties. The company men had stopped coming when the Red Pine mine shut down, sealing its shafts and scattering its workers to the wind. Clara crouched suddenly, her mittened hands brushing aside a pile of rusted nails and broken glass at the base of an iron post. Something here, she said, her voice tight with curiosity. Lila stepped closer. Beneath the debris, Clara's hands closed around something rectangular, heavy enough to drag at her wrists. She pulled it free with a grunt. It was a wooden box, maybe the size of a shoebox, dark with age, and damp brass corners dulled to greenish brown. The hinges were sealed under a crust of rust. You think it's worth anything? Clara asked, already turning it over. Lila studied it. The wood was scarred one side, bearing faint marks, like initials worn down by time. Looks too far gone to be worth much, she said slowly. Still, Clara replied, Someone left it here for a reason. They slid it into their burlap sack, the weight dragging the fabric low. Lila felt a strange heaviness in her stomach that had nothing to do with the box itself. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the wind had picked up and the clouds had thickened into a pewter sky, that they reached home. Evelyn was in her chair by the stove, her embroidery hoop resting on her knees, a small lamp casting warm light over her hands. "Find anything worth the walk?" she asked, her voice rasping at the edges. "A little," Lila said, setting the sack down. They pulled out the day's haul, 2 feet of copper wire, a handful of intact bottle caps Clara insisted on keeping for future trades, a bent spade head, and finally the box. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get that?" "By the split track," Clara said. "Half buried." Evelyn's lips thinned. "That's Red Pine Company's mark, or was?" "You leave it alone." "We were going to open it," Clara began. "Leave it," Evelyn said sharply, the firmness in her tone startling them both. She coughed, the sound rattling deep in her chest. "I've lived here long enough to know nothing good comes from things they left behind." Lila met Clara's gaze silently, agreeing to wait until Evelyn was resting. Evening fell early, the light going bruised and dim by the time someone knocked at the door. It was Logan Ward, his coat collar turned up against the wind, the county truck parked crooked in the yard. Ranger bounded to greet him, tail thumping once before he sat like the soldier he was. Logan stepped inside, the smell of cold air and road dust following him. "How's everyone holding up?" he asked, glancing at Evelyn. "As well as we can," she said, her hands moving automatically to straighten the blanket over her knees. Lila hesitated, then fetched the box from the corner. "We found this today," she said. Logan took it in both hands, his brow furrowing as he turned it over. His thumb brushed a faint crest, 2 crossed tools, a pickaxe, and something like a torch. "This mark wasn't on any of the public company logos," he said. "It's internal. Red Pine kept certain things off the books." He glanced at Evelyn. "Do you mind?" She gave a small, reluctant nod. Logan worked the rusted hinges with his pocket knife, careful not to split the wood. After a few stubborn minutes, the lid gave with a groan of old nails. Inside, beneath layers of paper, gone soft with rot, and a rag that smelled faintly of old machine oil, was a folded sheet of parchment. He spread it on the table. It was a hand-drawn map, sections labeled in faded ink tunnels marked in red. A strange symbol appeared over and over a triangle inside a circle. "What's that mean?" Clara asked, leaning over. "I don't know yet," Logan said. "But I'll find out." He folded the map and slid it into his coat. "This is important. Dangerous, even. If anyone asks about that box, you never saw it." "Understood." Both girls nodded, though Lila's mind hummed with questions. That night, after Logan left the house, fell quiet, except for the occasional crack from the stove. Evelyn had gone to bed early, her breathing uneven. Lila was already curled under her blanket when she heard the soft scrape of wood. She turned to see Clara crouched in the corner, prying up a loose floorboard. From underneath, she pulled an old metal cookie tin. "What are you doing?" Lila whispered. Looking, Clara said simply. Inside the tin were folded receipts, scraps of paper, a few coins, and near the bottom, a letter that had never been sent. "Dear Sierra, I know they say it's foolish to write you, but I have to. Your sisters ask about you now and then, more in the quiet than aloud. I tell them you were bright. You liked shiny things. You braided my hair better than I could ever do yours. I remember the way you used to hum when you thought no one was listening. I pray you're still humming somewhere." Clara read it twice, the words settling in her like stones. Beneath the letter was a photograph, faded, but clear enough to see a girl, maybe 17, with dark hair falling over one shoulder, her arm around a younger woman whose eyes matched Evelyn's. She slid both back into the tin, replaced the floorboard, and sat for a long moment in the dark. She didn't tell Lila what she'd found. Not yet. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the roof. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a train horn called, distant and mournful. And in Clara's chest, the shape of the day, shifted part discovery, part danger, and something else she didn't yet have a name for. The drive into Charleston was long enough for the edges of Logan Ward's thoughts to sharpen into a kind of readiness. The folded map sat in the glove box of the county truck, wrapped in a piece of brown paper, like something fragile or dangerous. The November sky was the color of tin, and the bare branches clawed at it as the wind shifted in slow, deliberate gusts. He parked 2 blocks from the Federal Building, the truck's engine coughing once before settling into silence. He'd called ahead, but Dana Price had agreed to meet him, not because of protocol, but because the urgency in his voice had carried the weight of more than just another lead. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead felt almost too loud in the stillness. An agent in a dark suit led him into a conference room, bare except for a table, 6 chairs, and a corkboard stripped clean. Dana Price stood at the far end of the table reading something from a folder before she closed it with a snap. Early 40s, tall, with posture that gave away nothing, and eyes that seemed to measure the air before they measured a person. Her hair braided tightly and tucked under a black cap framed a face that rarely wasted expressions. "Deputy Ward," she said. "You've been busy since your last call." He set the wrapped bundle on the table and unfolded the paper. The map, though brittle, opened without tearing. Donna leaned in, her gaze narrowing as she traced the faded ink with a gloved finger. "That symbol," she murmured, tapping one of the triangles inside a circle. "You know what it is? I was hoping you'd tell me," Logan said. She looked up. "It's an old holding marker, used by certain trafficking networks before transfer locations where victims were staged temporarily. We've seen it in 2 other states, both linked to sealed cases." Logan's jaw tightened. Red Pine Company shut down 20 years ago after a federal investigation. Forced labor, illegal confinement. Most of the case files got sealed. Dana nodded slowly. "And now you're telling me you found a map with those markers in Ash Hollow." "I didn't just find it," he said. 2 girls did. Lila and Clara Moore. They were scavenging for scrap to keep their family alive. If they'd left it in the dirt, someone else might have come for it before we knew it existed. Dana's eyes sharpened. "That's the same family that pulled you off the tracks." "Yeah." His voice dropped a notch. "That wasn't a random hit, Dana. Someone wanted me silenced. And I've got a good guess who." She folded her arms. "Say the name. Martin Hale." The syllables came out like a stone hitting the floor. "Former sheriff. Retired on early pension 5 years back. I filed reports, misuse of funds, witness tampering, coercion of minors. But nothing stuck. Records were altered. Evidence disappeared." Dana's expression didn't change, but her shoulders shifted slightly like she was adjusting to a heavier weight. "And you think he's still operating?" "I think he never stopped. He just went underground. Hale had the reach to leak my investigation route. The way I was left on those tracks, hands, feet, head covered, that's his style. I've seen it before in cases he wanted buried." Silence hung for a moment, filled only by the low hum of the lights. Finally, Dana pulled the map toward her and began marking locations on a notepad. "We'll need to cross-reference these with old mining records. If even one of these shafts connects to current missing persons cases." She let the sentence hang. Logan leaned forward. "I want in when you go. That's not standard procedure. Neither is surviving your own execution," he said. Dana studied him for a long beat, then gave a short nod. "Fine. But you follow my lead. We go in light, no noise, no alarms, unless absolutely necessary. If there are people still inside, we get them out first. Understood? Understood. That night back in Ash Hollow, the Moore household was quieter than usual. Evelyn had gone to bed early, worn thin from the day's coughing fits. Lila sat by the stove with a book she wasn't reading, eyes flicking to the window each time Ranger's silhouette passed outside. Clara was at the kitchen table sketching in her small notebook. But it wasn't bottle caps or patterns from old quilts. This time it was a face. Dark hair falling in soft waves, eyes that seemed to hold both laughter and something heavier. She was working from memory now, piecing together the image from the photograph she'd seen in Evelyn's hidden tin. Sierra. Every line she drew felt like pulling a thread she wasn't ready to explain. She'd thought about telling Lila, but the words stalled each time. How could she talk about a sister they barely knew, whose absence was wrapped in their mother's silence? She shaded the curve of Sierra's jaw, remembering the way the letter had been folded, the way the ink had bled slightly into the paper. I pray you're still humming somewhere. What you drawing? Lila's voice broke her focus. Clara flipped the notebook shut. Nothing, just doodles. Lila frowned but didn't push. You're quiet tonight. Just tired, Clara said. And it wasn't a lie, not exactly just not the whole truth. 2 days later, Logan returned to the house. Ranger greeted him first, tail thumping against the porch boards. Lila opened the door, surprise flickering across her face. You're back, she said. I said I would be. He stepped inside his coat, damp from the drizzle. Is your mom awake? Evelyn appeared from the back room, her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. Deputy Ward, I didn't expect to see you so soon. Logan hesitated, then said, I wanted to check on you, and to tell you. The map you found, it matters. A lot. Evelyn's eyes sharpened. Matters how? It could lead us to people who've been missing for years, he said carefully. But it's dangerous. I need you and the girls to stay quiet about it. No one outside this house can know. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. We can do that. Lila and Clara exchanged a glance. Lila's expression was puzzled, but Clara's was guarded, as if she were already carrying more than just the secret of the box. Back in Charleston, Dana Price was moving fast. She'd pulled 2 junior agents into a secure room and pinned a copy of the Red Pine map to the wall. Mining blueprints were spread across the table, layered with newer aerial images. Here, she said, tapping a point marked with the triangle in circle symbol. This shaft was sealed in '98. Official records say it's collapsed. But these drone images from last spring show fresh excavation on the south slope. One agent frowned. Could be kids messing around. Donna shook her head. Too clean, no graffiti, no scattered debris. Whoever's using it is keeping it hidden. Logan stood at the corner of the table, arms crossed. Hale always liked places people forgot about. Less chance of someone stumbling in by accident. Dana looked at him. We go in 2 nights from now. Minimal team, full tactical gear. You and Ranger are on point for scent detection. If Hale's inside, we take him alive. If there are captives, they come first. Logan gave a single nod. He'd been in enough operations to know the difference between preparation and overconfidence. This was the former, but the stakes made even careful planning feel like walking a tightrope over ice water. That evening, as rain pattered against the clinic windows where Logan was restocking supplies for the op, Clara lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the notebook hidden under her pillow. She thought about Sierra's face again, the tilt of her smile in the faded photograph. If the map led to what Logan thought it might, there was a chance, a slim, dangerous chance, that Sierra was somewhere behind one of those marked doors. Clara turned toward the wall, listening to the wind curl around the corners of the house. She hadn't told Lila yet. She wasn't sure if she was protecting her sister from false hope or protecting herself from the moment that hope might die. In the dark, Ranger's claws clicked softly on the floorboards as he made his patrol through the house. Clara watched his shadow pass under the crack of her door and felt for the first time in years that something was moving toward them, not just danger, but the possibility of an answer. The wind off the ridge smelled of stone dust and rain that hadn't fallen yet. It pressed against the slope in restless bursts, pushing through the dark like it wanted to warn anyone who might listen. Logan Ward crouched low near a stand of leafless birch, his gloved hand resting lightly on Ranger's shoulder. The dog's ears flicked forward, nose tilted into the cold air. They were a half-mile from the old red pine property line, though the posted signs had long since rotted to blank boards. Behind him, the FBI's small entry team was a row of muted shadows. Dana Price in the lead, her face barely visible beneath the brim of her cap, 2 agents behind her with equipment packs and suppressed rifles slung low. They had hiked in single file for the last hour, keeping to the game trails to avoid leaving a path visible from the air. "Still confident he'll find it?" one of the younger agents whispered. Logan didn't look away from Ranger. "I trust him with more than my life." At the sound of his name, Ranger shifted, drawing in a slow breath through his nose. Then, with no hesitation, he padded forward paws, sinking into the damp layer of leaves. He moved along the contour of the slope, head down tail level, tracking something that wasn't scent alone, but the subtle fingerprint of disturbed ground. They reached a tangle of scrub oak and rockfall, where the hillside looked as if it had slumped decades ago. To anyone else, it was a place to pass by. Ranger didn't pass it by. He stopped pawed once at the loose soil, then began digging in short, urgent bursts. Dirt and leaf litter sprayed back in low arcs. "Here," Logan said quietly. Dana came up beside him, scanning the slope. At first all she saw was the uneven scatter of stone, then half buried under brush, a rusted steel grate, its bars warped one corner, bent up like something had pried it open. "Looks like you were right," she murmured. Logan knelt, running a hand along the cold metal. Fresh scratches cut through the rust. Recently used, more than once. The younger agent moved forward, but Dana's hand shot out in a silent command to hold. "Ward, you and Ranger take point." Slow and quiet. Logan nodded, unhooked the latch on Ranger's harness, and gave the single hand signal they'd worked out years ago. The dog lowered himself, muscles taut, and slipped into the darkness beyond the grate, his nails clicking softly on stone before being swallowed by the muffled air. Back in Anash Hollow, Evelyn Moore sat at the kitchen table, staring at the lamp's small circle of light. Outside, the wind pressed against the siding with a low moan. Lila and Clara were in the other room, sorting through a box of fabric scraps. She could hear the murmur of their voices, the occasional laugh, but her own hands were still. It had been years since Sierra disappeared, but nights like this brought it all back, the sound of the front door closing the evening she didn't come home. The long silence afterward, the endless winter of not knowing. Evelyn could still remember standing on the porch, looking out into the black hills, feeling like the dark was holding something it would never return. She'd told herself not to think of it now. Not when the girls had been through enough. But Logan's visit, the mention of the map, had set the memory loose again. She reached for her embroidery hoop, then set it down. The needle felt too sharp tonight, her fingers too unsteady. On the ridge, Logan slipped through the grate after Ranger, his flashlight held low to keep the beam from throwing shadows too far ahead. The tunnel smelled of damp stone oil, and something older, a metallic tang that clung to the air. Dana followed then the 2 agents. The walls narrowed, forcing them into single file. Underfoot, the ground was a mixture of packed dirt and crumbling rock. Water dripped somewhere deeper in each drop, echoing like a distant clock. Ranger moved ahead with deliberate caution, pausing now and then to test the air before continuing. Logan watched the set of his shoulders, the way the fur along his spine stayed smooth. No immediate threat yet. They came to a section where the tunnel bent sharply. Logan raised a hand for the team to stop. He edged forward just far enough to peer around the corner. The beam of his light caught the edge of a wooden support beam rotting at its base, and beyond it a faint shimmer of something metallic embedded in the rock wall. Dana moved up beside him, her voice barely above a breath. "Looks like someone reinforced this recently." "Or patched it," Logan said. "Could mean it's still in use." They pushed on slower now. Every sound, the brush of a boot, the creak of old wood, felt amplified. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, carrying with it a stillness that didn't belong underground. At the Moore house, Clara laid out the scraps of fabric in neat rows. "This one's the best for the quilt edge," she told Lila, holding up a strip of faded red cotton. "You're thinking about something else," Lila said, narrowing her eyes. Clara hesitated, then shrugged. "Just wondering about the map. What if it really leads to someone?" Lila gave a small smile. "It's Logan's job to find out. Ours is to stay here." Clara looked down at the cloth in her hands. Stay here was what they'd done the night Sierra vanished, and it had never felt like enough. The tunnel widened into a low chamber where the ceiling sagged under heavy beams. Against one wall, a stack of wooden crates sat covered in mildew-stained tarps. Logan lifted the edge of one tarp, revealing metal canisters stamped with dates from only a few months ago. Dana's brow furrowed. Supply drops. Someone's been stocking this place. A faint scuffing sound drew their attention toward the far end of the chamber. Ranger was there, nose pressed to a seam in the wall. Logan joined him, running his hand along the rock until he found it a narrow gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. "This could be an access point into the main shaft," he said. Dana checked her watch. "We go in now. No waiting. Hale could be moving people any day." Logan gave Ranger the signal again. The dog pushed through the gap first, disappearing into shadow. One by one, the rest followed the narrow passage, forcing them to turn sideways at times. When they emerged, the air was different, staler, and tinged with something sour. Logan's jaw tightened. Places like this didn't just hold people. They held what had been done to them. Dana's voice was steady but quieter now. "Stay sharp. This is where we find out if the map was worth the risk." Ranger's head lifted, suddenly, ears locking forward. Logan felt the shift in him, the tension that meant he'd caught something. Ahead, the darkness pressed closer, as if guarding whatever lay beyond. Back in her chair, Evelyn rose and walked to the window. The hills were nothing but darker shapes against the sky, their ridges sharp in the thin moonlight. She wrapped her cardigan tighter, not against the cold, but against the unease that had settled into her chest hours ago. She thought of Sierra again. Not the missing girl from the photographs, but the child she'd been, the one who had tied ribbons in her sister's hair, who had learned to braid faster than Evelyn herself. The wind rattled the porch rail, and Evelyn told herself it was just the weather. But somewhere deep down, she knew something was shifting in those hills tonight. She turned from the window, the lamplight spilling across the floor in a long, narrow beam. In the other room, Lila and Clara were still bent over their fabric, their heads close together. Evelyn watched them for a moment, holding on to the sight. She didn't know what the next days would bring, but she knew that if the hills decided to give something back, it might not come without cost. The narrow passage opened into a larger chamber. The walls bowed with age, the ceiling stitched together with timber supports that looked as though they had been standing since the mine's earliest days. The air here was heavier, as if it had been breathed too many times before. Logan Ward swept his beam across the floor. It caught on something pale against the dirt, a scrap of fabric torn from a thin blanket. Beyond it, another lay folded in the corner, not by accident, but in the deliberate way people fold what little they have left to keep. Here, Donna Price murmured, her voice low, but clear enough for the team to hear. She crouched, lifting the corner of another blanket. Beneath it was a shallow dent in the dirt, the imprint of a body that had lain there recently. A metal bowl sat beside it, the rim bent, its surface filmed with the chalky residue of dried food. Logan's gaze moved from the bowl to a smaller object half hidden under a crate. A child's sneaker, its canvas scuffed laces knotted into a frayed tangle. "Someone's been here," he said quietly. "And not long ago." The chamber held more signs and overturned cup footprints, pressed into the damp earth, strands of hair caught in a rough nail on one of the support beams. The impressions were soft, but distinct, too fresh to belong to ghosts of the mine's past. Dana rose to her full height, her jaw tight. "They've been moved?" Logan scanned the ground again. The patterns told him as much, footprints leading toward a shadowed corridor at the far side of the chamber. He had tracked suspects before, followed the language of their steps, and here it spoke of urgency, of people shepherded out quickly, but not without order. "They left in a group," he said, his voice sharpening. "One adult, maybe two, with smaller steps clustered between. They knew we were coming, or at least suspected someone might find this place." The pressure in the room shifted, tightening around them. Every tick of the watch on Logan's wrist seemed louder than it should have been. "Ward Dana said you and Ranger take that corridor. We'll cover your 6. The corridor was narrower, the air stale with a different kind of rot. Ranger padded ahead, his nose low, moving with the unhurried precision of an animal that knows the difference between a cold trail and one still warm. His tail stayed stiff, neither wagging nor drooping, just a steady counterweight to his movements. Halfway down, Logan's light caught the dull gleam of metal in the wall ahead. A door set deep into the rock, framed not by wood or stone, but by a steel housing that didn't belong in a mine over a century old. The hinges were blackened, the lock plate warped and blistered. Burn marks spread out from the lock in dark petals, each line of soot a record of heat that had licked at the metal in an attempt to force it open. Dana moved up beside him, her gloved hand brushing the surface. "Somebody tried to breach this recently." "Or tried to seal it," Logan replied. "Either way, they didn't finish the job." He crouched, inspecting the bottom edge. Dust was disturbed here, but not in a natural way. It had been swept forward, masking the subtle groove where the door met the threshold. The smell was sharper too, not just metal and soot, but something bitter that clung to the back of his throat. Ranger's nose was working furiously now, drawing in the air through the gap at the bottom. He gave a short, sharp chuff and glanced back at Logan, the kind of look that said, "There's something here." "Set the perimeter," Dana told the agents. Quiet breach. The younger tech, Callie, moved in, kneeling before the scorched lock. Her tools clicked softly against one another as she worked, inserting a narrow probe, then a magnet, then a palm-sized charge no bigger than a matchbox. She worked with quick, economical motions, murmuring the count under her breath. A muted pop broke the tension, the sound swallowed instantly by the stone. The door gave a reluctant sigh as it eased open an inch, the air that escaped rushing past them, in a stale, humid wave that carried with it the faint trace of mildew. And something else, human, unmistakable even in its faintness. Logan eased the door wider, the hinges complaining softly. Ranger slipped through first, his paws silent on the concrete floor beyond. Inside the space was claustrophobic. The ceiling was low enough that Logan had to keep his head slightly bowed, the walls lined with rough concrete instead of the mine's usual jagged stone. In the cone of his flashlight, the shapes resolved 3 thin mattresses against one wall, each covered by a blanket worn thin from use. Against the far corner, a metal bucket, the air around it heavy with the scent of waste. Beside it, a pile of plastic water bottles, some crushed, some still capped and full. But there was no one here. Ranger moved from mattress to mattress, sniffing each one, his body language taut but not urgent. The scent was strong, recent. He knew these trails were no more than hours old. Logan crouched, touching the corner of one blanket. It was still faintly warm, the kind of warmth that lingers after a body has been lying there for hours, not days. They were were here, he said. Today. Dinah's gaze swept the room, cataloging every object, every trace. Then where are they now? Logan rose, scanning the walls. One section of concrete bore a different texture, smoother, as if it had been poured more recently than the rest. He moved closer, running his palm across it. Listen, he said. Dana tilted her head. There it was, a faint, hollow echo beneath the solidness. Callie joined them, pressing her ear to the wall. There's space behind this. Ranger had already shifted his attention to the far corner, where a small vent was set into the wall near the ceiling. The grate was covered in a thin layer of dust, except where streaks showed it had been handled recently. He stood on his hind legs, sniffing at it, then dropped back down, tail-lashing once in irritation. They went through here, one of the agents asked. Not the captives, Logan said. Too small. But someone passed items through. Food, maybe. Or used it to check in without opening the main door. Dana's jaw tightened. Which means they had no intention of letting them out except on their own terms. Logan turned back to the hollow-sounding wall. If there's space behind here, it might connect to another tunnel. And if they were moving the captives fast, they'd use the most concealed route. Callie was already unpacking a fiber-optic scope. She drilled a small hole near the base of the wall, the bit whining softly. When she fed the scope through the small screen in her hand, flickered to life, showing a dimly lit passage beyond. The beam from the device's light caught the back of a crate, the edge of another metal door, and just for an instant, a shadow slipping out of frame. Movement, Callie whispered. Dana didn't waste a second. We go now. That passage breach it quiet. The next moments were a blur of silent coordination. The team positioned themselves on either side of the wall section, the breaching charge set with the precision of long practice. Logan kept his eyes on Ranger, who stood poised at the ready, every muscle engaged. The charge went off with a muffled thump, and the panel gave way in a shower of dust. Ranger darted through the gap, first Logan on his heels, the rest of the team fanning out behind them. The passage beyond was narrow and sloped downward. Fresh footprints marked the dust-bare feet and the tread of heavy boots alike. The air was cooler here, threaded with the faint rhythm of dripping water somewhere ahead. Ranger took the lead again, his breathing even, his pace measured. He was tracking now, every step purposeful. Ward Dana called softly from behind. How fresh minutes, Logan said, without looking back. Maybe less. They followed the trail until it opened into another chamber. This one smaller, the walls closer. A single light bulb swung from a cord, casting restless shadows. In the center of the room was another steel door. This one unmarked, its surface clean compared to the grime of the mine. A padlock dangled from the latch, but it was snapped open, the shackle bent. Logan pushed the door in. The hinges gave a low moan, and the smell that came out was heavier now. Stale sweat, damp fabric, the residue of too many bodies kept too long in one place. Inside, there were signs of confinement everywhere. Short chains bolted to the wall, a thin line of chalk where a bed frame had once sat, drawings scratched into the concrete, simple shapes, a sun, a tree, a dog that looked almost like Ranger. They were here? Dana said, her voice quiet but firm. And they left in a hurry? Logan added. We're right behind them. Ranger sniffed at the far wall, then gave a low whine, pawing once at the base. Logan knelt, shining his light there. A narrow crawl space just high enough for a person to move through on their hands and knees, led away into darkness. The air flowing from it was fresher, laced with the faintest hint of pine resin. Logan met Dana's eyes. That's an exit route. She nodded once. We move before we lose them. Logan signaled Ranger forward, the dog disappearing into the crawl space without hesitation. The scrape of his paws echoed ahead, guiding them toward whatever waited on the other side. In the space they left behind, The thin bulb continued its slow sway, shadows stretching and folding, as if the walls themselves were remembering the people who had been there hours before. And though the room was empty now, the air still held their presence, proof that they had been alive, proof that they could still be found. Logan's pulse quickened. The captives were close, and somewhere beyond this crawlspace, so was the man who had taken them. The crawlspace spat them out into a chamber, unlike the others. Here the walls had been lined with rough plywood, and the low ceiling sagged under the weight of years. A single bulb hung from a wire, its light flickering in a jittering rhythm that threw everything into stuttering fragments, shadows, leaping faces, shifting between clarity and blur. Logan Ward's breath came slow and steady as he stepped through the narrow opening, sweeping his flashlight in a controlled arc. The beam caught movement small, quick, then froze on 3 figures huddled together in the far corner. 2 were clearly young, their knees drawn to their chests under thin blankets, eyes wide and unblinking. Between them sat a taller girl. Her shoulders squared, her gaze fixed on the intruders with a wariness that was more defiance than fear. Ranger moved first, padding forward with careful steps, head low, ears angled forward. The taller girl's eyes flicked to him, a flicker of recognition passing across her face, not of him specifically, but of something that wasn't a threat. Dana Price signaled for the others to hold position, her voice low and calm. "We're here to help. You're not in trouble." The older girl shook her head once, her voice rasping but steady. "Don't touch them. Help them first. They're weaker." Logan crouched, lowering his flashlight so it wouldn't blind her. "We'll get all of you out," he said, his tone even the kind he used with victims in shock. "You're safe now." The girl's gaze settled on him, fully searching his face. "Is this real? I've had this dream before." "It's real," Logan said. "What's your name, eh?" A beat passed before she answered, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Sierra Moore. But they made me call myself Sarah." The name struck him with the weight of recognition. Lila and Clara's sister, Evelyn's daughter. The girl whose absence had carved a hollow into that family's life. Behind her, the 2 younger girls began to sob quietly. Sierra glanced back, putting a hand on each of their shoulders. "Help them first," she repeated. Dana gave a sharp nod to the medics, who moved in with practiced efficiency, wrapping blankets around the smaller girls, checking pulses, murmuring reassurances. Sierra stood only after the others were lifted to their feet, her legs trembling, but her posture still proud. Ranger stepped closer, pressing his muzzle gently against her thigh. She flinched at first, then slowly reached down, fingers brushing over the fur behind his ears. "Is he yours?" she asked Logan. "No," Logan said. "He's his own." The extraction moved fast after that. The medics led the 2 younger girls through the crawl space toward the waiting team on the other side, while Logan and Dana stayed with Sierra, keeping her between them as they navigated back through the twisting passages. But as they neared the surface, a voice crackled in Donna's earpiece, urgent, clipped. Movement at the ridge. Pickup truck tarp over the cab. Trying to get out the north trail. "Hail," Logan muttered. Donna's expression hardened. "Cut him off." They emerged into the cold night air just as the call came through again, vehicles stuck perimeter, closing in. Martin Hale's escape was anything but graceful. The old pickup sat half sunk in the frozen ruts of an abandoned logging road, its camouflage tarp tangled in the branches above. The engine coughed once, then died. 2 agents moved in from the left, another from the right, weapons low but ready. Hale threw the door open, boots crunching on the hard ground as he tried to push past the first agent. He didn't make it 2 steps before being tackled, the breath driven out of him in a grunt. "Get your hands off me!" he barked, his voice rough with years of smoke and whiskey. Logan arrived in time to see the years written on him, gray at the temples, face puffy and red-veined. but the eyes still holding that same smug glint he remembered from every confrontation in the precinct hallways. Dana knelt beside him, holding up a clear evidence bag, already heavy with what they'd pulled from his coat. A burner phone still warm from his pocket, 3 SIM cards, a small notebook filled with coded names and dates, and a thumb drive. "I should have buried you deeper." Hale spat at Logan, lips split from the scuffle. Logan's voice was ice. "And yet here we are. Shame your secrets aren't buried with you." The agents hauled him to his feet, cuffed and cursing, and led him toward the waiting vehicle. Back at the mine's perimeter, Sierra sat on the open tailgate of a transport van, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The medics had checked her over bruises along her cheek, a split lip. Her wrists chafed from restraints, but she'd refused the offered stretcher. Logan approached quietly, Ranger at his side. "You're going home," he said. Sierra looked out toward the dark line of the hills. "Home doesn't feel real yet." "It will," Logan replied. "They've been waiting for you." Her eyes flicked to him. "Lila and Clara." He nodded. "And your mom." Sierra's fingers tightened on the blanket. "They kept me alive," she said after a pause. "Not for kindness, just because I was useful. But I kept thinking about them. I didn't know if they even remembered me." "They did," Logan said. "Every day." For a moment, her expression wavered, something breaking through the steel she'd wrapped around herself. Then she reached out, resting her hand on Ranger's head. "Guess you're the one who found me." Ranger leaned into her touch-tail, giving a slow, deliberate wag. The night deepened, the mine falling silent, now that its secrets were spilling into the hands of the law. Hale was already on his way to a secure holding facility. The other captives were en route to a clinic, accompanied by agents who would see them into safe houses. Sierra's transport would take her somewhere different home after a stop for medical evaluation. Logan had arranged it himself, making sure the route bypassed the main roads where news crews might gather too soon. As the van door closed, Sierra caught his gaze through the narrow gap. "Tell them I'm coming," she said. "I will," Logan promised. The door latched shut, and the van pulled away, its taillights vanishing into the black. Logan stood there a moment longer, Ranger pressed against his leg, both of them watching until there was nothing left to see but the frost-covered road winding back toward Ash Hollow. The Moore house was quiet in the hours before dawn, the kind of quiet that held its breath. Evelyn sat in her chair by the front window, cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders, her embroidery hoop untouched in her lap. Lila and Clara had fallen asleep together on the couch, worn out from a day they didn't understand in full, but felt in their bones. A light appeared at the end of the rutted drive, soft at first, then growing into the steady glow of headlights. Evelyn rose slowly, her knees stiff, her breath catching as the vehicle came to a stop outside. She could make out Logan's shape as he stepped from the driver's seat, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door. Sierra stepped down. For a moment, Evelyn didn't move. She saw her eldest daughter in pieces, the familiar set of her shoulders, the waves of her dark hair, the same eyes though now rimmed with shadows. It was like looking at a ghost who had chosen to stay. "It's you," Evelyn whispered. Sierra's voice shook. "It's really me." Evelyn crossed the porch in 3 uneven steps, and Sierra was in her arms. The embrace was fierce, trembling. Evelyn's fingers clung to the back of Sierra's coat, as if letting go might make her vanish again. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again," Evelyn murmured into her hair. "I didn't know either." Sierra set her own arms tightening. The commotion stirred the girls inside. Lila rubbed her eyes, confused at first, until she saw the figure in the doorway. Clara froze, her breath catching audibly. Sierra looked at them and smiled through tears. "Hey, you two." They didn't move at first, just stared as if afraid to shatter the moment. Then Clara stepped forward, quick and certain, throwing her arms around Sierra's waist. Lila followed slower, pressing herself into the circle of her sister's arms. All four stood there in the open doorway, tangled together, the cold air curling around them, but unable to reach the center of that reunion. The days that followed moved in two currents, one slow and tender at the Moore home, the other swift and relentless in the county courthouse. Martin Hale was arraigned within 48 hours of his arrest. The courtroom was packed, the wooden benches filled with townspeople who had long whispered about his corruption, but had never dared speak it aloud. Now they watched him in shackles, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting to the gallery only once, and quickly away when he found Logan there. The prosecution's opening statements were simple and damning: human trafficking, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. The evidence, already heavy with witness statements, was made heavier by the contents of Hale's truck. The burner phones, the coded notebook, the thumb drive containing photographs and ledgers that no one in the room could forget after seeing. Logan testified briefly, his account precise, stripped of any flourish. He spoke of the map, the mine, the rescue. Dana Price followed, laying out the broader operation and linking Hale to networks beyond Ash Hollow. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, there was no cheer in the courtroom, only a heavy shared exhale. Judge Helen Whitford sentenced him to 45 years without parole. Hale did not look up as the gavel fell. 3 days after the trial, the town gathered for something far different. The small park near the center of Ash Hollow had been cleared of snow, and a temporary stage stood near the gazebo. Mayor Samuel Carter stood at the microphone, his voice carrying in the crisp winter air. Today, he began, we recognize a hero who cannot speak for himself, but whose actions speak for the very best of us. He gestured to the side of the stage where Ranger sat, tail still, posture impeccable. Ranger, the mayor continued, demonstrated courage under pressure, unwavering loyalty, and a determination to protect life that should inspire us all. He held up a small velvet box. Inside lay a silver badge engraved with the state's emblem. Stepping forward, he lowered the medal onto Ranger's dark collar. The dog stood steady, gaze calm, as the crowd applauded. Lila clapped hardest, her eyes bright, cheeks flushed from the cold. Beside her, Clara leaned down to whisper, "We should make him his favorite treat tonight." On the other side of the stage, Sierra knelt to meet Ranger's eyes. Her hand rested on the side of his neck. "You didn't just save me," she said softly. "You reminded me how to be brave." Later, as the crowd dispersed, Logan lingered at the edge of the park, watching the Moores together. Evelyn's arm was looped through Sierra's, the two younger girls on either side. Ranger trotted ahead, ears pricked as if guiding them home. The air was sharp with the smell of wood smoke from chimneys, the sky washed in late afternoon gold. Logan felt the weight of the past week pressing against the quieter moment now, like the echo of a storm that had not yet truly passed. This was only the beginning, he knew. Healing didn't happen in a day, or even in the bright warmth of a reunion. There would be nights when Sierra woke in the dark, hearing doors she couldn't open. Days when Evelyn's breath would hitch at the sound of a train horn. Hours when Lila or Clara would glance at their sisters silently, measuring the distance between who she was and who she had been. But for now, there was the sight of them together, moving down the snowy street as one. For now, there was the knowledge that a thread once severed had been tied again, awkwardly, imperfectly, but strong enough to hold. Ranger glanced back once, catching Logan's eye. The deputy gave a small nod as if to say, "We'll see this through." And though the road ahead was long, Logan believed it. The cold deepened as the sun slipped lower, but in Ash Hollow something else had taken root, something that felt, if not yet like peace, then at least like the first step toward it. The winter sunlight in Ash Hollow had a different quality now. Still thin, still cold, but warmer at its edges, as if even the sky recognized the town had survived something it would not soon forget. Sierra felt that change most sharply, on the morning she walked to the Ash Hollow Women and Children's Resource Center, the modest brick building tucked beside the library. She had stepped through those glass doors for the first time a week earlier, heart-tight, unsure if she belonged in a place meant for healing, when her own wounds still felt raw. Harper Lewis, the center's director, had met her in the lobby. Harper was in her late 40s with short auburn hair and an expression that balanced steadiness with kindness. "You must be Sierra," Harper had said, her voice gentle but certain. "I've been expecting you." Sierra had almost turned back. "I'm not sure I'm ready to help," Harper finished for her, smiling in a way that left no space for shame. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to show up. That's the hardest part." Now Sierra showed up every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Her role wasn't official. She was a volunteer learning as she went. But the center had a way of drawing her in and making her feel that what she brought mattered. She started small sorting donations in the storeroom boxes of baby clothes, shelves of canned goods, stacks of paperback novels with worn spines. But slowly, Harper began asking her to sit in on group sessions. Some days Sierra would simply listen, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea as other women told their stories that bent in familiar ways with losses and recoveries that felt like reflections of her own. On other days, she'd help with activities for the children, painting afternoons, where little hands left colorful smudges on paper and on her sleeves. Reading circles, where she learned that a soft voice and a steady presence could be as important as the words themselves. One afternoon, Sierra found herself in the small counseling room with a girl no older than Clara. Her name was Millie, and she sat curled in the armchair, knees drawn up, eyes wary. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," Sierra told her, taking the other chair. "We could draw instead. Or I could tell you about my dog, Ranger." Millie's gaze flickered with a trace of interest. "What kind of dog?" "A German Shepherd," Sierra said. "Big, with ears that look like they catch every sound in the world. He once found a map hidden in an old book, and it helped save people." Millie's eyes widened, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. "That sounds like a story." "It is," Sierra said, leaning forward just a little. "And if you ever want to tell me yours, I'll listen the same way Ranger listens, like it's the most important thing in the world." They spent the rest of the session sketching pictures of dogs. Millie's all with floppy ears, Sierra's with tall, alert ones. At home, the pace of life had found its own gentle rhythm again. Evelyn was regaining her strength, moving more easily around the kitchen, her embroidery hoop once more filled with delicate stitches. She'd taken to sitting in the sunniest corner of the living room each morning, a blanket over her lap, her work basket beside her. She noticed Sierra's comings and goings without comment. But sometimes when Sierra came through the door in the evening, Evelyn's eyes would soften with something like relief. "Good day," she'd ask. "Good," Sierra would reply, though they both knew good carried layers, difficult moments, small triumphs, and the quiet weight of listening to others' pain. Lila and Clara had thrown themselves into their own project. They had decided that the story of Ranger and of everything that had happened needed to be remembered properly. On the table in their shared bedroom sat a wide notebook with a cracked blue cover. Inside, in Lila's careful handwriting and Clara's looping scrawl, the days unfolded like chapters. They wrote about the cold morning on the tracks, about Logan, and the map about the mine and the rescue. In the margins, Clara added little sketches. Ranger sniffing the ground, Logan with his hat pulled low, Evelyn's face lit by candlelight. Some pages were covered in watercolor illustrations. Ranger appeared most often, ears up, tail high, eyes bright. One drawing showed him wearing the medal Mayor Carter had given him, a proud tilt to his head. Another had him curled beside Evelyn's chair, a guardian in repose. One Saturday evening, Sierra returned from the center to find the living room full of light and laughter. Evelyn was at the kitchen counter helping Clara ice a batch of cookies. Lila sat cross-legged on the rug, reading aloud from their journal, while Ranger lay beside her, chin on his paws. Sierra paused in the doorway, letting the warmth of it settle into her. "What's tonight's chapter?" she asked. Lila looked up, grinning. "The one where Ranger finds the secret door." "That's a good one," Sierra said, hanging her coat. "You should make sure you write it exactly how it happened." Clara piped frosting onto a cookie in a shaky spiral. "We already did." And I drew the door. "It's got the right number of hinges." Sierra laughed, moving to help Evelyn with the next tray. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and cinnamon. The windows fogged from the oven's heat. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, catching in the light from the porch. Later that night, when the house was quiet, Sierra sat at the small desk in her room, writing in her own notebook. It wasn't a journal exactly, more a record of the people she was meeting at the center. She didn't use names, only initials and small details. H brings her own tea bags. M drew a shepherd with wings. T laughs like she's surprised by the sound. She wrote not just what they said, but how they said it. The pauses, the way their eyes shifted, the moments when their hands stilled. It was a habit she didn't fully understand yet, but it made her feel as if she were holding something safe for them, the way others had once held things safe for her. When she closed the notebook, she reached down to scratch Ranger's head where he lay by her chair. His eyes opened slowly, warm and steady. "You'd like Millie," she whispered. "She's quiet, but she'd understand you." Ranger gave a low, contented sigh, his tail thumping once against the floor. The next week, Harper called Sierra into her office. "I wanted you to know," she said, "we've had 3 new referrals from out of town. One of them, her story is close to yours. I thought you might want to sit in." Sierra hesitated. Close how Harper's expression softened. Taken when she was young, found just a few weeks ago. She's still finding her footing. Sierra thought of the cold room in the mine, the sound of boots on the floor outside the door, the first rush of light when it opened. She nodded. "I'll be there." That afternoon, she sat beside the girl in the small circle of chairs, saying little, letting silence stretch when it needed to. The girl's voice was thin at first, but by the end of the hour, it had grown steadier. Sierra didn't realize she was holding her breath until she felt it leave her. By the end of the month, Sierra had become part of the center's fabric. Harper teased her about having her own corner, and the children would sometimes run to greet her before she had taken off her coat. She was still learning how to carry the weight of other stories without letting it sink her, but she was also learning that there was a kind of strength in being present for them. At home, Evelyn's cheeks had more color. Her stitches grew neater, and her laughter came more easily. Lila and Clara's journal was nearly full, the last pages reserved for what they called the after, though neither could quite define what that meant. One night, as they all sat together, Evelyn in her chair, Sierra on the couch with the girls, Ranger stretched out between them, Evelyn looked around the room and said softly, "I think we're making something new here. Not what we had before, but something just as strong." Sierra met her mother's gaze and nodded. She knew exactly what Evelyn meant. Healing didn't return you to the person you were. It made you into someone else entirely. And sometimes that someone could hold more than you thought possible. Ranger's ears twitched, his eyes half closing, as if he understood. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and steady, covering the scars of the ground, at least for a while. The first warm day of March came like a quiet promise carried in the softer air, and the way the sunlight lingered a little longer on the rooftops of Ash Hollow. Snow still clung to the edges of the fields in thin, melting sheets. But the ground had begun to loosen, giving way to damp earth that smelled of renewal. It was Sierra's idea to go back to the tracks that morning, the same stretch of cold steel and gravel, where their lives had turned sharply into a different story. Lila had been surprised at first, unsure if returning would feel like reopening an old wound. But Sierra had only smiled and said, "Sometimes going back is how you move forward." They set out just after breakfast, Ranger trotting ahead, his paws stirring small clouds of dust from the thawing path. Sierra carried a young apple tree, its roots wrapped carefully in burlap and tied with twine. Lila held a small gardening spade she'd borrowed from Mrs. Harlan down the road, the handle worn smooth from years of use. Clara had something hidden in the pocket of her jacket, a length of deep red ribbon satin faded in places that had once belonged to their mother. The walk to the tracks was quieter than usual. Even Clara, who often skipped ahead and filled the air with chatter, seemed to feel the weight of the moment. The rails glimmered faintly in the sunlight as they came into view, stretching away in both directions, carrying with them memories that could not be untangled from the sound of the wind through the dry grass. Sierra stopped at the exact spot. She knew it without needing to measure the distance. The gravel here was darker, some of it still faintly indented from where boots had dug in, from where hands had pulled and hearts had raced. She set the burlap-wrapped sapling down gently, as though it were a child that needed to feel the ground before it was truly theirs. "This is the place," she said softly. Lila knelt beside her, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Right here?" "Yes." Sierra's voice carried no hesitation. "Here where we were, all three together. Even before we knew we'd be together again." Clara crouched down on the other side, her small fingers digging into the loose stones until she found the firmness of soil beneath. She pulled out the ribbon, holding it up so the sunlight caught its sheen. "We can put this on," after she said. They began to dig. The ground was still stubborn from the cold, resisting the first few cuts of the spade. But Lila worked steadily, loosening the soil a little at a time. Sierra took over when the deeper layers needed turning, her gloves darkening with damp earth. Clara knelt nearby, scooping out smaller clumps and breaking them apart with her hands. Ranger lay close by, his head resting on his front paws, eyes following every movement. Now and then, he would stand, sniff the air, and then settle again, as if keeping watch over the moment itself. The hole grew wide enough, deep enough to welcome the sapling. Sierra lowered it carefully, spreading its young roots into the hollow. Together they began to fill in the soil, patting it down gently, each press of their hands sealing something unspoken. When the tree stood steady, Sierra stepped back, brushing her palms on her jeans. Lila retrieved a small tin of water she'd brought from the house, pouring it slowly at the base. The earth darkened, drinking deeply. Clara, holding the ribbon, moved closer. She looped it around the slender trunk, tying it into a bow that sat just above the lowest branch. The red shone against the pale bark, a flash of memory and love bound into a single knot. "This was Mama's," Clara said quietly, her voice thinner than usual. "She wore it in her hair sometimes. I thought it should be here, so she's part of it too." Sierra's throat tightened. She placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "She is part of it, always." They stood together for a long while, letting the breeze pass over them, carrying the faint scent of thawed grass and iron rails. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its clear, bright notes, threading through the air. Lila glanced at her sisters. "Do you think it will grow here? By the tracks?" Sierra looked at the sapling, its small branches tipped with the faintest buds. "I think it will. Trees don't always choose where they grow. Sometimes they just take root where they're planted, and they make the place theirs." Clara tilted her head. "Like us?" Sierra smiled, her eyes warm. "Exactly like us." The sound of an approaching train rose in the distance, a low hum, then a rumble, then the steady rhythm of steel on steel. They stepped back from the rails, standing together as the train swept past. The wind of its passing lifted Sierra's hair and set the ribbon fluttering against the bark. When the last car disappeared, the air seemed stiller than before, as if the ground itself had acknowledged what they'd done. Ranger trotted over to the tree, sniffed the base, then sat down beside it, facing the tracks like a sentinel. His ears twitched toward the horizon, but his body was relaxed, content. They didn't rush to leave. Instead, they found a spot on the embankment, sitting side by side. Lila rested her elbows on her knees, looking out at the stretch of rails. Clara leaned into Sierra, her head against her sister's arm. "I used to think the tracks were only about endings," Lila said after a while. "That people went away and never came back. But now, it's not like that anymore." Sierra nodded slowly. "It's still a place where things can change. But change doesn't always mean losing something. Sometimes it means finding something you didn't know was missing." Clara's voice was soft. "Like you." Sierra drew her closer, pressing her cheek to the top of Clara's head. "Like me." As the sun began to lower, they stood again. Sierra took one last look at the young apple tree, its shadow falling thin and long across the gravel. "In a few years," she said, "it'll have blossoms, and later apples. We can come pick them together." Lila grinned. "We'll make pies." "And cider," Clara added, "and give some to the center where you work." Sierra laughed. "All of that. But no matter what, this tree will always be more than just a tree." They began the walk home, the warmth of the day still on their backs, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the faint rustle of the ribbon in the wind. Ranger stayed close to Sierra's side, glancing back only once toward the tracks, as if committing the sight of the tree to memory. Behind them, the sapling stood rooted in fresh earth, the red ribbon bright against the fading light, marking not only where something once nearly ended, but where something else had begun. The spring sun hung low enough to cast a warm, mellow glow over Ash Hollow, painting the air with a golden softness that made the edges of the world seem kinder. The apple sapling stood quietly by the tracks, its thin trunk swaying faintly in the breeze, as if testing its place in the world. Sierra stood a few feet away, her hands tucked into the pockets of her denim jacket, studying the young tree, with a gaze that held both tenderness and steel. "It's going to live," she said at last, her voice steady but touched with emotion. "Just like me." The words slipped into the open air without hesitation, and though she hadn't planned to say them, they settled in the ears of her sisters like a promise. Lila, standing to Sierra's right, glanced up with a soft smile that reached her eyes. Clara, smaller and still brimming with the restless energy of youth, reached out and gently brushed her fingers over the red ribbon tied around the trunk. Ranger lay stretched out beneath the sapling's slight shadow. His front paws were crossed, his chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. But his amber eyes remained alert, scanning the horizon with the quiet vigilance that had defined him since the day they first met. The sun lit the edges of his fur, giving him an almost haloed outline against the earth. To anyone passing by, he might have looked completely at rest, yet those who knew him could see the subtle tension in the angle of his ears, the way he breathed in the wind, as though measuring its scent for danger. The sound of the breeze weaving through the tall, pale grasses was joined by the occasional call of a meadowlark. It was the kind of day that seemed made for stillness, for letting the mind wander without fear of where it might go. For Sierra, though, stillness was something she was relearning. There had been months, years, when she'd believed stillness only existed in locked rooms under shadows that lengthened into every corner. Back then, quiet had felt like a cage. Now, here beneath the sun, quiet had become something else entirely. It was a companion, a chance to breathe without the weight of looking over her shoulder. She crouched down beside Ranger, running her fingers through the thick fur at his neck. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes briefly before scanning the tracks again. "You know," Sierra murmured more to herself than to anyone else, "if it weren't for him, I'm not sure we'd all be standing here." Clara immediately knelt down, wrapping her arms loosely around Ranger's middle. "He's part of the family," she said, her voice muffled against his fur. Not just family, Lila added from above them. I don't know. Like a guard for our hearts. Sierra's lips curved upward. That's exactly what he is. Evelyn had stayed home that day, resting as the spring light filtered through the curtains of the small wooden house. She had smiled when Sierra told her they were going back to the tracks, her eyes glistening in that way they did whenever she was both proud and deeply moved. She's healing, Sierra thought now, picturing her mother's face in the soft light. We all are. But it's going to take time. And that was fine. Time, Sierra had learned, could be a friend when you weren't afraid of what it might bring. The afternoon stretched on the air, warming just enough to coax the first hints of green from the stubborn ground. The sapling swayed gently, the red ribbon fluttering with each movement like a heartbeat you could see. Sierra straightened, looking from the tree to her sisters. One day it's going to be taller than all of us. Stronger, too. Lila tilted her head. Will it remember this day? Sierra's eyes softened. Maybe not the way we do, but it'll grow because of it. Every root it puts down will be tied to what happened here. Clara's gaze lingered on the ribbon. Like how we grow because of what happened to us. Yes, Sierra said quietly. Exactly like that. As the shadows lengthened, a train approached in the distance, the hum of its wheels building into a low thunder. The three sisters stepped back, standing together, as the locomotive roared past the wind from its passing, lifting their hair and setting the ribbon dancing wildly against the bark. When it was gone, the world fell back into that springtime stillness. Sierra took a deep breath, feeling the warmth in her lungs, the rhythm of her own heart, the steady presence of her sisters beside her. She looked down at Ranger. You'll keep an eye on it for us, won't you? He gave a short, low huff in response, almost like an answer, before settling his head back on his paws. His eyes, though, never stopped scanning the distance. They began the slow walk home, leaving the sapling standing by the tracks like a sentinel of its own. Every few steps, Sierra glanced back, not because she feared anything would happen to it, but because she wanted to hold the image in her mind exactly as it was. Now small, but rooted, fragile, but determined. When they reached the edge of the hill, she stopped once more and turned fully. From here, the sapling looked even smaller against the wide stretch of sky. But the red ribbon was still visible, catching the sun one last time before evening. That tree, she said softly, mostly to herself, isn't just about us. It's for anyone who walks this way and needs to remember they're not alone. In the days that followed, Sierra found herself repeating those words to others at the Women's and Children's Center. She told them that sometimes healing wasn't about forgetting the pain, but about planting something that could grow beyond it. She shared her story when it could help and listened far more often than she spoke. The sapling became a quiet landmark in Ash Hollow. Passing trains would stir the ribbon, and travelers on foot sometimes paused, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Lila and Clara made a habit of visiting it on their own, sometimes with Ranger, sometimes just the two of them. They would sit by its base, draw in their notebooks, or read aloud from library books. Evelyn, when she was strong enough, came once with Sierra and placed her hand against the trunk, whispering something none of them could hear, but all felt in the way her shoulders eased afterward. By summer, small leaves unfurled along the branches, a green more vibrant than anything else on that stretch of land. Ranger continued his silent watch during their visits, lying in the same position as on the day they planted it, calm, yet always alert, as though understanding that some things were worth guarding long after the danger had passed. He would close his eyes sometimes, letting the sun warm his fur, but even then the faint twitch of his ears betrayed his readiness. Sierra often wondered if he knew just how much he had changed the course of their lives. On the first anniversary of Sierra's return, they gathered again at the tree. It was taller now, its branches reaching a little farther into the sky. The ribbon, though weathered, still clung to the trunk, a little faded, but unbroken. They didn't bring speeches or ceremonies, just themselves. their presence a testament to survival and to the unshakable ties between them. They stood in the shade it now cast, the air filled with the hum of summer insects, the faint scent of wildflowers carried from the meadow. Sierra placed a hand on the trunk, feeling the faint give of the bark beneath her palm. "You've made it through your first year," she whispered, though part of her words were meant for herself. Lila took her other hand. Clara leaned into her side. Ranger sat at their feet, his gaze sweeping the horizon one more time, before settling on the three of them, as if to remind them, without words, that they were safe. The story of the Moore family's survival spread quietly in conversations at the market, in letters sent to far-off friends, in the way strangers sometimes stopped Sierra to thank her for her work at the center. But the most enduring reminder was the tree and the dog lying in its shade. Ranger's eyes would close in contentment, but they never lost their sharpness when the world required it. That balance of peace and readiness was something Sierra tried to carry into her own life. Because courage, she had learned, wasn't a single act. It was a choice made over and over in moments big and small. And love, steady and unshaken, could turn even the darkest path into something worth walking. In the years ahead, the apple tree would bloom its blossoms white against the blue spring sky. Children would sit in its shade, couples would tie ribbons to its branches, and travelers would pause to rest beneath it, without ever knowing the full story. But for Sierra, Lila, Clara, and Evelyn, it would always be more than a tree. It was the place where past and future met, where fear gave way to hope, and where a faithful German shepherd reminded them that vigilance and love could stand side by side. And so, as the sunlight of another spring afternoon slanted across Ash Hollow, Ranger remained beneath the tree, his breathing slow, his gaze steady, a living reminder that every one of us can be the hand that pulls someone from the rails, the voice that says, "You are not forgotten."